It was supposed to be the perfect getaway. My friends and I had been planning this ski trip for months, and we finally managed to get everything together. The plan was simple: a week of skiing, drinking, and relaxing in a remote cabin in the Rockies. There were 6 of us: me, Alex, Jenny, Mark, Sam, and Rachel. We'd known each other since college and had been on countless trips together, but none like this. The drive up to the cabin was uneventful, though the roads became increasingly treacherous as we climbed higher into the mountains. Snow began to fall heavily, and by the time we reached the cabin, it was coming down in thick, blinding sheets. The cabin itself was old but sturdy, nestled among the pines with a breathtaking view of the valley below. We unloaded our gear and settled in, excited for the days ahead. The first couple of days were blissful. We hit the slopes early, savoring the fresh powder and the thrill of carving down the mountain. Nights were spent around the fireplace, sipping hot chocolate and playing board games. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside we were warm and content. On the 3rd night, things started to get strange. It was Mark who first noticed it. After a long day of skiing, we were all gathered in the living room when he pointed out the footprints. They were faint, barely visible through the swirling snow, but they were there, leading from the edge of the forest right up to our cabin, then disappearing around the back. We joked about it at first, blaming it on a stray hiker or maybe an animal. But deep down, I think we all felt a twinge of unease. That night, I struggled to sleep. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows and causing the old cabin to creak and groan. At some point, I must have drifted off because I was jolted awake by a loud crash. My heart pounded in my chest as I strained to listen. The others must have heard it too, because soon we were all gathered in the hallway, flashlights in hand. We found the source of the noise in the kitchen. One of the windows had been shattered, shards of glass scattered across the floor. Snow was blowing in, creating a small drift on the counter. We quickly boarded up the window, trying to convince ourselves that it was just the wind. But the feeling of being watched lingered. The next day, the storm showed no signs of letting up. We decided to stay indoors, not wanting to risk getting lost or injured on the mountain. Tensions were high, and we all felt a little on edge. Alex and Sam tried to fix the generator that had started acting up, while Jenny and Rachel attempted to get a fire going. I busied myself with making lunch, trying to keep my mind off the strange events of the night before. It was Rachel who found the second set of footprints. She screamed, and we all rushed to the window. These were different from the first ones, larger, deeper, and leading away from the cabin toward the dense forest. Fear settled over us like a heavy blanket. We debated what to do. Mark wanted to go after whoever was out there, but the rest of us managed to talk him out of it. Instead, we decided to stay vigilant and keep all the doors and windows locked. Night fell quickly, and with it came a sense of dread. We took turns keeping watch, but the hours dragged on without incident. Just as I was beginning to think it was all in our heads, I heard a soft scratching at the door. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The scratching continued, growing more insistent. I woke Alex, and together we crept to the door, armed with kitchen knives. When we flung the door open, there was nothing there, just the wind and the snow. But as we turned to go back inside, we heard it again, a low, guttural growl coming from the darkness. We slammed the door shut, bolting it and barricading it with furniture. The growling continued for what felt like hours before finally fading away. The next morning, we were all exhausted and on edge. The storm had finally subsided, but the footprints remained, circling the cabin. We decided to pack up and leave as quickly as possible. The drive down the mountain was nerve-wracking. The roads were slick with ice, and visibility was poor. But we made it down safely, and by the time we reached the main road, we began to relax. It wasn't until we stopped for gas that we noticed something strange. On the back of the car, etched into the frost-covered window, were 5 deep, parallel scratches. None of us said a word, but we all knew what it meant. Whatever had been out there, it had followed us. The rest of the drive home was a blur. We parted ways, each of us eager to get back to the safety of our own homes. We never spoke about the trip again. I haven't been skiing since, and the thought of those dark, snowy woods still haunts my dreams. Sometimes when the wind howls outside my window, I can almost hear that low growl, reminding me that some things are better left forgotten. We were searching for an adventure, something off the beaten path. Our usual ski resort was booked solid, and someone mentioned an old abandoned ski resort tucked away in the mountains, untouched for decades. It sounded perfect. No crowds, untouched slopes, and the thrill of exploring somewhere forgotten. There were 5 of us: me, Dave, Lily, Tom, and Sarah. We were close friends from university, always looking for the next great story to tell. The drive was long and treacherous. The road wound through dense forests, barely wide enough for our SUV. We almost missed the turnoff. It was nothing more than a gap in the trees, marked by a rusted sign that read, "Welcome to Pine Haven." The resort had been shut down in the 80s after a series of avalanches made the area too dangerous. But we were young and fearless, convinced we could handle anything. The buildings of Pine Haven appeared out of the snow like ghosts. The main lodge was a hulking, decrepit structure, its windows shattered and its wooden facade weathered gray. We parked and unloaded our gear, laughing and joking to mask our unease. The air was eerily still, the only sound the crunch of our boots in the snow. We set up camp inside the lodge, choosing a large room with a massive fireplace. Tom got a fire going while Dave and I explored the rest of the building. Most of the rooms were empty, save for a few old pieces of furniture and tattered curtains. In one of the rooms, we found a stack of old newspapers. The headlines were faded, but one caught my eye: "Mystery of Missing Skier Deepens." That night, we gathered around the fire, drinking and telling stories. The wind howled outside, and the temperature plummeted. We talked about the old stories surrounding Pine Haven, rumors of missing skiers, strange lights in the woods, and the reason the resort had really been abandoned. We laughed it off, attributing it to local legend and overactive imaginations. The next day, we hit the slopes. The snow was perfect, untouched and powdery. It was exhilarating, and for a while, we forgot about the creepy old lodge. We spent the entire day skiing, only stopping when the light began to fade. As we headed back, I noticed something strange. There were tracks in the snow that didn't belong to us. They led away from the lodge and disappeared into the forest. That night, the unease returned. We barricaded the doors and windows, trying to convince ourselves it was just a precaution. But deep down, we all felt it. Something was wrong. In the middle of the night, I woke to the sound of footsteps crunching in the snow outside. I held my breath, straining to listen. The footsteps stopped, then started again, this time closer. I glanced over at the others, but they were all asleep. I didn't dare move. The footsteps circled the lodge, stopping briefly at each window. My heart pounded in my chest, but I stayed silent, hoping whoever or whatever it was would go away. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps finally receded into the distance. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. In the morning, I told the others about the footsteps. They laughed it off, saying it was probably just an animal. But when we went outside, the tracks were there, clear human footprints, leading around the lodge and off into the woods. We decided to stay together for the day, not wanting to split up. We skied again, but the fun was gone. We were constantly looking over our shoulders, jumping at every sound. On our way back, we found something that made my blood run cold. At the edge of the forest, half buried in the snow, was an old, rusted ski pole. It looked like it had been there for decades. Back at the lodge, we found the front door wide open. Snow had drifted in, and the fire had gone out. We quickly shut the door and lit the fire again, but the sense of dread was overwhelming. That night, we all stayed in the same room, taking turns keeping watch. I was on the last shift, just before dawn, when I heard it again, the footsteps. This time, they were inside the lodge. I woke the others, and we huddled together, clutching whatever makeshift weapons we could find. The footsteps grew louder, echoing through the empty halls. We heard a door creak open, then slam shut. The sound was coming closer and closer, until it stopped just outside our door. We held our breath, the silence deafening. The doorknob turned slowly, and the door inched open. I couldn't see who or what was there, but I could feel its presence, something dark and malevolent. Suddenly, the door flew open, and a figure stood silhouetted against the faint light from the hallway. It was a man, or at least it had been. His clothes were tattered, his face gaunt and hollow. His eyes were empty, devoid of life. He took a step forward, and we screamed. In a flash, Dave lunged forward, slamming the door shut and bolting it. The man outside began to pound on the door, a guttural moan rising from his throat. We knew we couldn't stay. We grabbed our gear and climbed out the window, fleeing into the night. We didn't stop running until we reached the car. As we sped down the mountain, we could still hear the pounding echoing in our ears. We never spoke about Pine Haven again. We all went our separate ways, each of us haunted by the memories of that night. I sometimes wake in the middle of the night, convinced I can hear footsteps outside my window. And I know, deep down, that the man from the lodge is still out there, waiting for the next group of foolish adventurers to stumble upon his forgotten domain. When my sister Karen suggested we spend a weekend skiing in the remote Appalachian Mountains, I hesitated. The lodge she found online was incredibly cheap, almost too good to be true. But we both needed a break from the city, and the idea of secluded slopes and cozy nights by the fire was tempting. So we packed our gear and headed out on a Friday afternoon, eager for adventure. The drive was long and winding, taking us through dense forests and narrow mountain passes. As we climbed higher, the snow began to fall heavily, and the road became increasingly treacherous. By the time we reached the lodge, it was nearly dark. The building was old, its wooden exterior weathered and covered in snow. There were no other cars in the parking lot, which struck me as odd for a ski lodge, but Karen assured me it was just off-season. The owner, a grizzled man named Joe, greeted us at the door. He had a peculiar look in his eye, a mix of curiosity and something darker. He led us to our room, a small but cozy space with a large window overlooking the slopes. After a brief tour, he handed us the keys and warned us to stay close to the lodge, especially at night. When we asked why, he simply muttered something about wildlife and left us to settle in. That first night, we lit a fire in the fireplace and enjoyed a quiet dinner. The wind howled outside, and the lodge creaked and groaned, but inside, we were warm and safe. We talked about our plans for the next day, excited to hit the slopes early and make the most of our weekend. The next morning, we were up before dawn. The snow had stopped falling, leaving a pristine blanket of white across the landscape. We geared up and headed out, eager to explore the untouched trails. The skiing was incredible, the powder perfect, and the scenery breathtaking. We spent the entire day on the slopes, stopping only for a quick lunch. As the sun began to set, we decided to head back to the lodge. The shadows were growing long, and the temperature was dropping rapidly. As we made our way down the last run, I noticed something strange. There were tracks in the snow, crisscrossing our path and leading off into the dense forest. They didn't look like animal tracks, more like footprints, but oddly spaced and uneven. I pointed them out to Karen, and she shrugged it off, saying it was probably just someone from the lodge exploring. That night, we were exhausted but content. We sat by the fire, sipping hot cocoa and reminiscing about the day. Joe stopped by to check on us, his eyes darting nervously around the room. He warned us again to stay indoors after dark, emphasizing the danger of the forest at night. His behavior unsettled me, but Karen brushed it off as typical mountain eccentricity. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by a strange noise. It sounded like whispering, faint but persistent. I strained to listen, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispers grew louder, and I realized they were coming from outside our window. I crept over and peeked through the curtains, but saw nothing but darkness and swirling snow. Unable to shake the feeling of being watched, I woke Karen. She was groggy and irritated, but when she heard the whispers, her expression changed to one of fear. We decided to wake Joe and ask him about it. We grabbed our coats and ventured into the dark hallway, our footsteps echoing in the silence. Joe's room was at the far end of the lodge. As we approached, we noticed his door was ajar. A dim light spilled out into the hall, and we could hear muffled voices. We knocked softly, and the door swung open. Joe was sitting at a small table, his back to us. He was talking to someone, but there was no one else in the room. "Joe?" Karen called out, her voice trembling. He turned slowly, his eyes wide with fear. He looked past us, as if seeing something we couldn't. "You shouldn't be out here," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "It's not safe." Before we could ask what he meant, the lights flickered and went out. The lodge was plunged into darkness, and the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. Panic set in, and we grabbed Joe, pulling him out of the room. We stumbled back to our room, using our phone flashlights to navigate the dark halls. Once inside, we bolted the door and huddled together by the fire. Joe seemed delirious, muttering about the shadows and the lost ones. His words made no sense, but his fear was palpable. The whispers outside grew louder, more urgent. I felt a chill run down my spine, and I knew we weren't alone. Suddenly there was a loud crash from the window. The glass shattered, and a freezing gust of wind blew into the room. We screamed and backed away, but there was nothing there. Just the darkness and the whispers. Joe grabbed my arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "You have to leave," he said, his eyes wild. "They're coming for you." In a frenzy, we gathered our things and fled the room. The lodge seemed to come alive around us, the walls groaning and the whispers following our every step. We burst out into the night, the cold biting at our faces. We didn't stop running until we reached the car. As we sped down the mountain, the whispers faded, but the sense of dread lingered. We never went back to Pine Haven. I later learned that the lodge had a dark history, tales of guests who had vanished without a trace, whispers of ancient spirits that roamed the forest. Karen and I never spoke of that night again, but sometimes, when the wind howls and the shadows grow long, I can still hear the whispers, reminding me of the horrors that lurk in the forgotten corners of the world.